Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's a real pleasure to be here. So, as said, my name is Boutaud. I'm from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism's Bureau Local team. These are the other members of the team and our Twitter handle. Megan is the leader of the team. Before joining the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, she was the data editor at the Times of London. Maeve and Garrett are two senior reporters who have won different awards in journalism. And myself, I work as sort of the technical lead, and before joining the Bureau, I worked at Trinity Mirror's data unit as reporting on stories for their local and regional papers on database stories. I think the best way to quickly describe us is that we are a data journalism team that collaborates with local reporters, technologists, and anyone who would identify as an engaged citizen to work on investigative news stories, as long as you are interested in transparency and public interest journalism. We welcome people into our network, and we let people know when we have a new investigation starting, when we start to work on a new project, and what opportunity there might be for collaboration. Before I jump further into how we do that, what we do and why we do it, and on a later portion of the talk, I will go through some of our stories, what's the data we used behind them, and how we collaborated with the network to make them. But I'll make a quick parenthesis about the Bureau of Investigative Journalism to understand how Bureau Local came to be. The Bureau was created in 2010. At the time, the newspapers were under a lot of financial pressure, and a lot of the teams that were getting cut were the investigative journalism teams. The reason for that is obviously that investigative journalism is extremely costly. Usually projects can take months to develop. They take more resource, they take more staff under financial pressure. These were the teams that were getting cut. And the Bureau was created as a way to kind of fill a void within the industry. The way the Bureau works is when we are done, when we have an investigation and the story is ready, we partner, and by partner I mean give the story for free to the best organization to reach the right audience for the story. So for example, if it's more of a social impact story, the partner will often be maybe The Guardian. If it's a political story, we'll partner with the Times of London. If it's maybe a public affairs investigation, BBC Newsnight or Channel 4 Dispatches would be great partners. Now you might start to spot a trend with those partners that I just mentioned. All of them are still large organizations that are extremely well funded and that all have investigative journalism teams. So when the Bureau did an independent audit in 2015, that was what came back. The idea was, so we need to partner with local journalism. Those are the places, local, regional, community papers don't have those resources. How do we partner with them? Since the way we used to work was that we would just take a story and once it was ready, go to a partner, that it would have required to have journalists in every area of the UK to do that. That's not possible for our organization. We're not resourced that way. Data was a clear way to do this by having a national data set, being able to break it down, and then have both regional stories and a national story to share. The problem obviously being something that I experienced in some way at Trinity Mirror, that if you try to, you can understand the data, you can understand that there is an anomaly, that there is a spike in certain areas, but you don't understand the reason for the spike. So we couldn't work with journalists. At the end, we had to bring people to collaborate from the start so we could mix what the data tells us with the local knowledge of the local reporters. For me, this goes beyond just telling stories locally and telling a national story. It's about reconnecting narratives, I would say. This is the map of the 2015 general elections in the UK. But we had a party, which is people not voting. And we give them a seat if people not voting in a constituency is bigger than the vote of the party that won that constituency. And that's the winning party. So basically, the winning party of the election would have been people not voting. This means that the system is flawed. To me, this is partly due to, well, you could say it's simply people being disconnected and feeling disenfranchised towards the system. I think part of it is that the way data journalism had worked, and by being only in kind of national media and bigger news organizations that do only or mostly national stories, people were getting fed averages. And the problem with the average is that it's never really relevant to you. So the person that you could have a quarter in the economy where things go up, but the person reading that in Middlesbrough, in Grimsby, in Blackpool, in Swansea, they will all say no, that's not true. They won't feel like they are being part of a narrative. I think that data makes it a lot easier to reconnect narratives because you understand that there are several areas experiencing the same problems and that are maybe going in the opposite direction to the trend. And then you're not leaving people alone. You're explaining their relation to what's happening globally or in the rest of the country. And that's what I find extremely interesting with the potential for data within local journalism. I'll make a quick tangent because every organization has kind of its own definition of what data journalism is. Our definition with the team we have is pretty simple. It's that data journalism is just journalism, but it appeared more recently, so we needed a newer and trendier term for it. And that's why people started saying data journalism. But at the end of the day, data, when I say data is not numbers, obviously for a lot of people of the room, that comes obvious because we know that it can be a string, an integer, a Boolean, whatever type of data. But beyond that, we say so because for us, it's not a number, it's a digitized information. And it's the same information that you would have previously got from reading hundreds of reports, but instead of reading those hundreds of reports, it has been digitized and therefore is available in a larger scale. But it's the same information that the regular journalist would work with. Data is social because obviously it's the digitized account of the society. It became obvious. People started becoming obviously aware of it with the Cambridge Analytica story a few weeks ago. Like suddenly, oh, yeah, there's a lot of data about myself on Facebook and on social media. Beyond that, obviously, our public bodies are the same. They produce reports on their staff, the products of their decision on our public bodies. And for me, it's important to take that information and give it back to the people who create it in a way. And finally, I'll say that data is not a lead, it's a lead, it's not the story. So we always start with the data, we investigate it, but then we also always need to partner with the local journalists to find kind of the reasons behind it. It's often where we become alert of a situation, but unless you're able to put the context of what's happening on the ground, because there can always be different reasons for it. We worked on council finances a lot recently. And the reason that reserves went down in basically every council, reserves level, is because they had to use their reserves to balance the budget because of austerity. But obviously, you have to know that in some areas, that won't be the case. The reason it went down is because they had flooding problems in the spring, and they had to use it for flood maintenance. And that's a very basic example, but in every case, numbers need to be investigated. The reason we want to bring tech methods to journalism is really that has been my slogan and the thing I've been battling for. It's to make the available accessible. If I go back, I did my undergrad in journalism, only in journalism, but it became plain obvious to me. I was downloading more and more data because I came from I had a science interest as well, and I used lots of statistics. And that data became my source. Now, if I had decided that I wanted to be a correspondent in the Middle East, it would have made sense for me to learn Arabic. If I decided that I wanted to be a correspondent in South America, it would have made sense for me to learn Spanish. But I was working with data, and it made sense for me to try to learn Python. And it's the same way, and I think it helps to try to present it in such a way where it's not a kind of a magical way to interact with information that is hidden in the back end, but just it's like a language to work with a source the same way I would if that source spoke Spanish. And it's the same reason why I try to use digitized information often when I talk with people rather than data, which often seems like in the mind of some people as 1 and 0s in green over a black screen scrolling up and down. So yeah, decided to learn Python, and as I did, I kind of learned from the community aspect of it and the fact that I wanted to do it for my stories. It became obvious that those skills would be useful not only for me, but for a newsroom. And now Bureau Local is giving me the opportunity to try and use those skills not for a newsroom, but for local papers and local journalists and people who are just curious about public interest stories across the UK. There is an ever-growing amount of information that is getting digitized. There is an ever-growing amount of data out there, but that is only available to a few. Even when I was at Trinity Mirror, I could see all these new data, digital, interactive team units being created in all the main news organization. But outside of those news main organization, those teams don't exist, and there are no one to make sense of those resources. I want to and this is where tech comes in, and I want to put you a little bit in the shoes of some of those local reporters. First of all, a lot of them have now contractual obligations on the number of stories and even on the number of clicks they're supposed to produce in a week. So that's not going to be useful for investigations. If they take time and you don't produce your 25 stories you must do in a week or your 25,000 click you must get in a week because you worked on a longer investigation, you are in contractual breach. If the paper happened to be looking to make cuts at the time, well, you become an obvious target since you breached your contract. There are two main problems: time and resources. Resources, easy to understand. You're interested into trying to find what are the drugs that doctors prescribe in your area. So you go to the Department of Health website. You download the file. It's a CSV. That's good. You're quite good in Excel or even Google Spreadsheet. Let's say Excel. You try to open it in Excel. Whoops, the file is more than 10 million rows. Excel supports only about 1 million row. So it's going to break, and your investigation is done. For most people in the room, I guess this is not a problem. We can easily load it with the CSV module in Python. There is the time problem. This is an example of the time problem. It's not the most well-written. I just tried to condense it because when you talk to journalists, they're like, oh, it's only 7 lines. But you can make it more clear. But the idea being, if I try to get just the drug crimes in the UK, it's published in monthly CSVs, 1 CSV per month per police force. So if I try to get the yearly data, that's going to be 45 CSV times 12, so about 540 CSV that I will have to open, which are all a few thousand rows of codes, obviously depending. The Met files, the Metropolitan Police is a lot bigger than, I don't know, Somerset Police. But you're going to have to open those 540 files, sort them for drug crimes, and try to not make any manual error while copying and pasting them to have a single file of all the drug offenses if you're looking to compare your areas with other areas. That's going to be extremely time-consuming, and it's not error-proof. While this only takes 22 seconds to run and does the same job. This is why, for me, it's extremely important to get more tech resources in newsroom and to be able to collaborate. The tech sector has grown a lot, and especially the open data sector has grown a lot by collaborating and working openly with each other and learning from what others have done before. Platforms that obviously come to mind when I say that are like Stack Overflow, where we all ask each other questions and get answers and debate on which is the best one, depending on clarity, on the time it takes for the function to run, on the memory usage of the function. And we also do the same with building on top of what other work has been done before, like GitHub, where we all search for what other code has been written, and we can just add to it and then fork it back into the repo and propose modification. That's fantastic. That never happens in journalism, never. You think that people within a newsroom would collaborate together? That's not always the case, especially in local papers. We talked about the contractual obligation before. If I tell my ideas to the other journalist and I'm busy with a work and then he doesn't know what stories to do and then he does my story and I have less idea to get my quota of stories for a week, that doesn't seem productive. So it creates a problem in newsroom where even journalists in the same newsroom sometimes don't collaborate together. You don't build on top of each other's work because there is no legacy. News stories are made in a way that you produce one story and it's done, but there is never a file that gets published on how the investigation was done so that other people could do the same investigation for their own area. These are things that journalism can definitely learn from and that at Bureau Local we try to bring in. To answer that, for example, we do write for every investigation, we do a reporting recipe that explains how you can go from the data that we open and we make public, how you can go and then report for your own area, and where you can find more information, what are questions to ask about this data. I'll take a quick look at my notes, sorry. Yeah. So, sorry about that. I guess the step that happens when you do all of that is I go to a lot of open data events, and I talk to people in the open data community because we love working with open data at the Bureau a lot more than doing the traditional way of journalists, which is to do FOIs, Freedom of Information Request. The problem with freedom of information is that almost no one looks at them. You asking that to a press officer in some department, they will just ask for something to someone else that will produce a file and send it to you. But if you're trying to do that for every local authority or different government departments, the interpretation of your question will be different within each department because there is no standard. So you will get very mixed bags answer, and it's hard to run an analysis on that. So we like working with open data, but when I go to open data events, a lot of the time people ask me, well, how do we get people to work with journalists? How do we get journalists to work with the data we produce? Because there is a lot of transparency at the moment where people produce open data, but there is a lack of accountability where the open data is taken and then journalists can report on it and go further and hold power accountable where there are things that are obviously wrong, where we can find systemic wrong within the open data. But all of that, before we can turn that kind of transparency into accountability, it all starts with making what's available accessible by taking those large files, breaking them down, and making them into a format that is useful for everyone. Even when we think of open formats, they're not really open if the large majority of people cannot use them. I'll go into more of the stories we did. So this is normally where they should be the dog that says this is fine with everything burning behind him. Because 1 month after we started a year ago, we started early April last year. A month after we started, Theresa May, and not even a month, 3 weeks after, Theresa May announced the snap election for June. So we thought that we would have time to build this collaborative network, probably do a little tour of the UK, go meet local journalists everywhere, set things up nicely, but no, there had to be an election, so we had to jump into stories right away. This ended up being a blessing because it allowed us to quickly learn from some mistake and understand how we want to work with people. This was the first investigation that came out. We partnered with an open tech organization called Who Targets Me, who wrote essentially a Chrome plugin that you could download, and it would capture every political advert on your Facebook feed and feed it back to us so we could see what the advert was and where it was captured, in which constituency, based on the IP address, which obviously can be flawed, but still better than what was available. We then partner with local journalists and send them the different adverts we were seeing, where there was an increase in targeted advertising. So we were able to take the data that Who Targets Me were taking, we were breaking it down to local level, and we were sending to the Bristol journalist all the adverts captured in Bristol. We were sending to the journalist in Birmingham the adverts captured in Birmingham, and so on. The interest for that story was that obviously political parties have a fund that they can dedicate to their national advertising during the campaign, but there is laws that forbid the national budget for advertising to go into local elections. The local budget for advertising is much smaller. Now, if you're doing targeted local advertising on Facebook, which of those budgets are you using? I don't think that has been disclosed by the parties, but that was what we were trying to raise. If you're using targeted local advertising and you have the resource to do so, which not every party has in equal measures, then there is a problem for democracy. We also, during the election, this was our second major investigation out of 4 investigations we did during the month of the election, which was more about trying to see which voter group could change the result of the election. I'm happy to say that we're one of the few news organizations in the UK that said that Theresa May was likely to lose her majority, or at least have it dented. It felt our editors weren't happy, and we really struggled to find people to partner with because that was not the narrative that was being taught at the time. And didn't know how far we could push it. What happened is we partnered with statisticians to get a model. We looked at the 2015 election, which happened roughly at the same time, and the number of new voters in each of those constituencies, and the total number of new voters, so how new voters were created everywhere. And then we had a count, but only for the whole country, of the number of new voters, which, by the way, was a bit flawed because it's just one for every new voters, but recorded digitally also, so you could have written a bot that would have clicked on that button thousands of times to make it go up. But nobody seemed to have done that, so we were able to come up with a model which was accurate to about 1% to calculate the number of new voters in every constituency. Every constituency that we would go to report on the piece, we obviously called them when we were close enough to the election and they had a final count to be able to make sure that the information we had was correct. There was the new voters. If they were bigger than the margin, counting them as an influential voting group. There was also UKIP and Green voters, because it was a snap election. UKIP and Greens didn't have the time to mobilize in every constituency. So if the number of UKIP was bigger than the margin last time, if the number of Green was bigger than the margin last time, those are all things we looked at as voting groups that could swing a seat on their own. And the result was we got about 70 seats from that, about half of which were conservative, half of which were Labour. The thing is, every Labour seat was a seat they had won every election since the 70s, the 50s, even the 30s. So a Labour stronghold. Every Conservative seat was a seat they had won at the soonest 3 elections ago, but all in the 2 or 3 last elections. So much more likely that they would go back to voting Labour like they already did in the past. That was the main indication for us that there was enough seat for Theresa May to enter majority, if not to lose it. So we partnered with the statistician, but also we organized our first AG Day at the time, which was held simultaneously in 5 cities. We split the team to send the team in 4 different ones. I was in Cardiff. There was people in London, in Birmingham, in Glasgow, and in Bournemouth. And we invited people, journalists, students, anyone who were in the city to come and look at the data with us. A main positive was actually, I bragged on our model a little bit, sorry for bragging earlier. We don't deserve credit for it. The credit goes to a journalist from the local newspaper, the Bristol Cable, who pointed a flaw in our model because of how the possibility for students to register both at home and where they go to school. And we had to make correction to the model because of the local journalist who was aware that this was an issue in the Bristol West constituency and pointed it, and we corrected the model, and that's what made the model good. It was the collaboration with the local journalists which really helped push this investigation further. We did 2 other small investigations during the election that I'm going to go over very quickly. We did one on crowdfunding, which was essentially there was a lot of online crowdfunding during the election, and once again, you need to be able to, if there's a donation of more than £500, you need to be able to say who gave the donation, and the crowdfunding websites, because of privacy issues, are not allowed to give the information of the users, so you wouldn't have been able to track those £500 donations, so technically they would be illegal donations in some cases. The result was at the end of the election, only a month after, 2 months after we started, there was already 350 people who had signed up to the network, and there was a total of 75 stories which had been produced both locally by national partners. Like you can see, this was the Yorkshire Post headline on dark ads, the Guardian headline on dark ads, and the Amen High, London Borough's front page on new voters. Following that, we had developed a good partnership at that point with our network. And what happened is we had the network starting to feed back to us. Now, when we do investigation, we invite people to join into a private Slack channel for each investigation, where we share information, where you might have an intuition about your own local area which could prove false, but by sharing it with others, they can investigate in their own area, and they will find it to be true where they are, and then feed back to the network. And that's where we try to do a lot of the bringing collaboration into journalism. One person who had liked working with us during the election, again, a journalist from the Bristol Cable, great cooperative journalism model in Bristol, came back to us, said, I had this lengthy FOI battle with the Home Office to check the nationalities of people stopped by immigration officers in in-country operations, so not airports, not ports, but really inside the country. And it turns out the vast majority of people stopped are British citizens. Now, the guidance from the Home Office requires their officers to only make a stop or a check if they have strong suspicion that the person could have broken immigration law. Now, the problem is immigration citizens cannot really break immigration law, especially when they're inside the country. So this pointed to clear suspicion of racial profiling. While it's not something we can necessarily prove from the data, it was something we could clearly put the fingers on, that there is a clear need for the law to change and for requiring immigration officers to at least have some sort of having to fill in the report what the ethnicity of the person was, or have the person decide if they want to say what their ethnicity was, to be able to prove if there's racial profiling or not. The interesting thing in this case also was that by partnering with local journalists in lots of areas, those journalists were all able to have access to their local MPs. So we had about 15 MPs speaking on that story. 3 of them raised it in the House, so there was a clear impact that we wouldn't have been able to have if we had worked alone. We would have talked maybe to 2 or 3 MPs, getting comments, and then publish them in our story, and that would have been it. Because we partnered with the local journalists, we had a lot more comments from a lot more MP, and it brought attention to the issue we were raising, which was raised in Parliament and brought further. I just put this because this was kind of I'm a big apologist, and there's two trends, two schools of journalism when it comes to data journalism at the moment. That's not something that people in academia say, that's just my feeling. I would describe it as the American school and the German school. And the American school is very much into interactives and how you visualize data to be able to communicate the story better. Me, myself, I'm closer to the German school, which is, I think, closer to the Python community in a way, by being more into what's happening on the back end. How do I take several data files and merge them together? How can I extract meaningful information from large data set? And then if the visualization is not the best option because it's just dense and text is enough, but you have found the information through taking lots of PDFs, turned them into text files, then treated the text files with Python, then that's maybe more, you reach other conclusion. But we also do data visualizations when the case is interesting. In this case, it was looking at the rise of farms requesting permits for intensive farming in the UK. It's quite fun. It looks kind of a disease at the end, where you start in 2005 now, and there's 47, and by the end, we're over 1,000 in 2012. So it really exploded in the last decades, the number of farms having permit for intensive farming. This should have been before. That's about the impact we had for the immigration story, which made The Guardian and the front page of the Bristol Cable, and was also shared in various local papers. And clearly proved to us the worth of what we were doing and having the network collaborate and bring stories forward to share with other local journalists. That's what I said before. You have problems with journalists collaborating together within their own newsroom. Now we had, for that story, a journalist wanting to share the result of his FOI with everyone. He said, I made the FOI. I was able to get the data for 11 major urban centers in the UK. I'm going to report on Bristol, and I wanted to be able to compare with other cities. But it would be a waste if I made that FOI and it would only be reported in Bristol. That's why you wanted to bring it to the network, and which by doing so, we had much more impact than we would have otherwise. This is a story we then did on domestic violence last autumn, a series of report, which was done by a mix of FOI, open data, and surveys to refuge managers, which were all mixed together to look at the pressure that domestic violence refugees are under. To give you an idea, there was a woman in Birmingham who the refuge had to close and she had to be moved elsewhere. And the closest place they could find that was available at the same time was in the islands to the north of Scotland, which is quite far from Birmingham. To say the least. And one of the interesting things for this investigation was also to kind of, by having all those mixed set of data, to be able to have mixed stories by bringing them together. We could have the story of talking about the cuts. We could have the story of talking about the delays from when money was agreed by the government for funding refuges, but the refuge only received the money about 6 to 12 months later. Now, if you were expecting that while it was supposed to arrive 2 or 3 months later. So if you said, oh, it's good, in 2-3 months I'm going to have my money, and then it arrives 6 months after that, you found yourself in a lot of pressures, and you might have to close before the money arrives. We were also, so all sorts of stories that came out of that, and then we kept working on the story, talking about the laws that were put in place to help fight domestic abuse, but that are really being patchy at the moment, such as controlling and coercive behavior or Clare's Law. Another thing that's interesting, one result of that investigation is we followed, there was a refuge where the roof collapsed in Westminster. And Maeve, who was the lead reporter on the story, followed the women that were in that refuges as they were being placed to another refuge for the maybe 6 months it took. And one of them was a stand-up comedian. So there's always also going to be kind of a tour where we're going to go with that comedian in every local area and talk, and she's going to do her show. Every local area that was, not every, but like 8 local areas where local reporters worked with us on the investigation, and she's going to do her show in the first part, and in the second part, Maeve is going to go on stage with the local journalist and her, and they're going to be able to talk more about what the issue was from a stats point of view, which is all about trying to reach as many people as you can and making sure that people engage with an investigation, which I find quite interesting. The following story, the following big project we worked on was council finances. The problem being councils are required to produce budgets of how they plan to spend money in a year. They're required to produce and to send to the government their budget. They're required to produce and send to the central government their outturns on how they did spend the money. But they produce drafts which are never centralized. But the drafts, which usually come in January and February ahead of the budgets being proposed in March, contains lots of information about the cuts they plan to make, but are never centralized. So the public never get the chance to have their say on what drafts really suggest or have an idea of what drafts budgets are on a national level and have a say before they become law effectively when the budget is passed in March. So we work to centralize all the budgets and look at which council was overspending, which planning historically and planning to cuts as a result in key area like adult services and children's services. Obviously, the drafts council produce are all extremely different. You have to go to all the different websites to be able to get them of the 350 council and go to the report and try to centralize it all together. So without tech work, it's an extremely hazardous task. We also organized a hack day from it, which was good in that one. We compile historic data, which is produced yearly on service level spending, and put it all together for the last 5 years, which become a large data set of over maybe a couple million rows. But then we were able to highlight case services by speaking with local government expert, which we brought inside the network, and ask them which area should journalists really focus on, and then produce smaller data set that the journalists could focus on. What was interesting is that each one of them was then able to find the key things for their own areas, and that's what they decided to write on. So the stories that the journalists produced in this case were very different from our national story that we decided to focus on, but there was a wealth of everything. That's the last story we're working on. We're trying to get a centralized count of homeless death in the UK, so that relies on a few automations to find whenever there's a local press press article being written. There's obviously not a lot of information on it. It's often dismissed as just a single case rather than something systemic, or just like, oh, the poor guy died on the street because he was cold or he did an overdose, and not trying to go and say, well, these are the area where it happens the most, and they all have cut kind of the same services, so this will be the end goal of this investigations. For now, we have produced just a display that kind of pay homages to the life, and that tells their story as much as we can. A cool thing about that is that the reporter can just fill a Google spreadsheet, and there's a Python automation that then looks if the spreadsheet is different than the one committed to GitHub, and if so, downloads it and commits it to GitHub. So basically, a journalist that has no tech skill, no HTML, no CSS, no JavaScript, no Python, is able to update the visual display of the interactive on the website, which I find really nice and is the kind of skill that can be brought to newsrooms as well. So that's the result of the work we've done so far. 13 months later, there's about 700 people who have joined the network. Obviously, not everyone is super engaged. A lot of people will decide which investigation they want to take part of, but we have an increasing amount of genuine interaction within the Slack about people just asking questions, and before we can even answer as a team, someone else from the network steps in and says, yeah, I will do that data visualization for you, or I can do that data work. There was 169 just local stories by local reporter produced, which are all, it might not seem like the biggest figure, but it's good to remember it's all investigations that wouldn't have been possible because of tech reasons to them, and that are all investigative by nature. And we've produced about over 40 open resources when it's either reporting recipes or data sets or code that just shows a bit about how to work with some of government files that we work with. And we're really looking forward to do more. And if you're interested, well, this is the bit.ly join Bureau Local, and you'll receive our next newsletter to know what projects we work on next. And if you're interested, I'd love to hear from anyone here. Yeah, most of the work we do is in Python as well for the backend, so it'll be a pleasure. Thank you all.